the details of the end of this great empire called Babylon. This chapter fulfills the prophecy concerning the image back in with Nebuchadnezzar and its transition from the head of gold to the chest and arms of silver. That's what we're seeing coming about here in this chapter. So let's go with chapter 5, verse number 1 through 4. Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the thousands. Belshazzar, whiles he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels, which his father, Nebuchadnezzar, and by the way, I'll explain that in a minute, he's not the real father of him, had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes and his wives and his concubines might drink therein. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass and of iron, of wood and of stone. So I want us to go first off and look at the chronological aspect here of what happened, because Nebuchadnezzar was the king of kings as far as the earth was concerned, not the king of kings of the Lord. But God said he is a king above all other kings. And he was that head of gold. Now, in this chapter, 70 years have passed since Nebuchadnezzar took captives from Jerusalem. And this is about 23 years after chapter 4 and his image of his that golden image of himself. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, and the nation started to decline from that point. There was a man that succeeded him, his son, evil Merodach, and he was Nebuchadnezzar's son. He's the one that released Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, from the prison, and he put him in a privileged position in the Babylonian court. So let's go over to 2 Kings, chapter number 25. 2 Kings 25. I'm going to begin reading in verse number 27. And it says, "And it came to pass in the 37th year of the captivity of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the 12th month, on the 27th day of the month, that evil Merodach, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, did lift up the head of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, out of prison." So he's the one that let him out and put him in a privileged position in the court. Now, this man, evil Merodach, he only reigned 2 years. And he was assassinated by his brother-in-law, who was Nergal-Sharezer. Go to Jeremiah 39. Jeremiah 39, verse number 3. "And all the princes of the king of Babylon came in and sat in the middle gate, even Nergal-Sharezer, Samgar-Nebo, Sarsechim, Rab-Asiris, Nergal-Sharezer, Rab-Mag, and with all the residue of the princes of the king of Babylon." So he was an official, this man, Nergal-Sharezer, he was an official under Nebuchadnezzar, and was involved in the release of Jeremiah from prison. Now, he reigned for 4 years before his death, and he was succeeded by his young son, who was named Labishai Marduk. Now, he reigned only 9 months before he was beaten to death by his priestly conspirators who had appointed a successor. And that successor was Nabonidus. Nabonidus was a former priest under Nebuchadnezzar. He was made king in 556 BC. He reigned 17 years until he was defeated by Cyrus and the Medo-Persian king. Nabonidus wasn't related to Nebuchadnezzar, so he didn't have a right to the throne. So what he did, he sought to secure his throne by marrying Nebuchadnezzar's into his family. So he married one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, who had a son named Belshazzar. And that's who we're talking about today. Now Nabonidus was more interested in religion than he was establishing a kingdom. And so he appointed his son, Belshazzar, as co-regent with him at the time. So Belshazzar was actually second in command of the Persians. In fact, if you look at Daniel chapter 5, he explains this to us. Verse 7, and this is Belshazzar now. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said unto the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with a scarlet, have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And he says the same thing in verse 16 and in verse 29. They will be the third ruler of the kingdom. The reason it's the third ruler, because Nabonidus is the first, and Belshazzar is the second. And whoever answers his request here will become the third. So Cyrus soon attacks Babylon, and Nabonidus when they were outside the city. And so he defeated Nabonidus, and who then fled to Borsippa, which was a city where he was eventually taken captive. So when he was then exiled to Carmenia, which is another province near Persia, and he ended up dying there. Now, going back to chapter number 5 with Daniel, and I want us to look here at the summons from the queen in verse 10. It says, now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom who is in the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom and was found in him, whom King Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father made master of the magicians and astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. So when we look back on this, as chapter 5 begins, it begins with his banquet, right? In verse number 1 and 2, we see that even though the city is being surrounded by the Medes and the Persians, they're on the outside. Belshazzar had confidence where he was that he was safe. The city, according to the Greek historian Herodias, the city was 15 square miles. And the walls, he says, was at least 80 feet high. That's pretty high if you think about it. No, not high, 80 feet thick. And that's still pretty thick. And 350 feet high. So these are huge walls that they think he's safe inside. And while this battle went out the outside and he caught his father, and there's a siege going on. It had 100 massive bronze gates, that he says. The city had an abundance of water because it was built over the Euphrates River. The river ran right through it. And what's interesting here is that seated on a raised platform, Belshazzar then gets drunk in the middle of all this with his wives and his concubines. Basically, it was one big drunken orgy, is what they were having. Go to Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31, yeah. Proverbs 31, verse number 4. It says, "It is not for kings, O Lemuel, it is not for kings to drink wine, nor for princes strong drink, lest they drink and forget the law and pervert the judgment of any of the afflicted." So the kings weren't to do this, but he certainly is doing it. In the book of Isaiah, chapter number 5. Isaiah 5. We're going to begin reading in verse 22. It says, "Woe unto them that are mighty to drink wine, and men of strength to mingle strong drink, which justify the wicked for reward, and take away the righteousness of the righteous from him. Therefore, as the fire devoureth the stubble, and the flame consume the chaff, so their roots shall be as rottenness, and their blossoms shall go up as dust, because they have cast away the law of the Lord of hosts, and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel." So he had the sacred vessels that were captured when Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem. And these came out of the temple that the people worship the Lord in. And he wants to desecrate them. He wants to show his blasphemy against God to those outside. He challenged God, and God, guess what? If you challenge God, what is God going to do? He'll accept the challenge. That's exactly what he did. Jeremiah chapter 50. Jeremiah 50. Verse number 1. "The word of the Lord spake again against Babylon and against the land of the Chaldeans by Jeremiah the prophet. Declare ye among the nations, and publish, and set up a standard. Publish and conceal not. Say, Babylon is taken, Bel is confounded, Merodach is broken in pieces, her idols are confounded, her images are broken in pieces." God makes it clear he was going to destroy Babylon. And these people back in Daniel chapter 5, look at verse 3. "Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and the princes, his wives and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone." So he despises, Belshazzar does, the one true God, and shows his contempt by praising these false gods that were made by man. God will not be mocked. Amen. Just make it clear. God is not going to be mocked. People mock him all the time, but he's going to get the last laugh. Amen? Or the last word, I should say. It won't be so funny. Jeremiah chapter number 51. Jeremiah 51, verse number 11. "Make bright the arrows, gather the shields. The Lord hath raised up the spirit of the kings of the Medes, for his device is against Babylon, to destroy it, because it is the vengeance of the Lord, the vengeance of his temple," which is what Belshazzar is doing. He is mocking the things that come out of the temple of God. And in same chapter, verse number 28, "Prepare against her the nations with the kings of the Medes." Remember, the Medes and the Persians are the ones on the outside of the wall right at this time. "The captains thereof, and all the rulers thereof, and all the land of his dominion." And verse 29 says, "And the land shall tremble and sorrow, for every purpose of the Lord shall be performed against Babylon, to make the land of Babylon a desolation without an inhabitant." Now drop down to verse 57, same chapter. It says, And I will make drunk her princes and her wise men, her captains, her rulers, and her mighty men, and they shall sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake, saith the King, whose name is the Lord of hosts. So God is not going to be mocked. He's going to make sure he's getting even with Babylon and their idolatrous ways. So Jeremiah has a few clues to how the military victory here is going to be won. Back in chapter 51, look again with me, if you would, to verse number 36. Verse number 36 says, Therefore, thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will plead the cause, I will take vengeance for thee. I will dry up her sea and make her springs dry. And the Babylonians shall become heaps, a dwelling place for dragons, and astonishment, and a hissing without an inhabitant. So he's going to dry things up. You need to understand, that's how the Medes and Persians defeated Babylon. They dried up, blockaded, put a barrier on the Euphrates River, and diverted the river, and there was no water on the inside. They were able to get in there. Now going back to chapter 5, let's look at the sign that God sent him. Verse 1, we see the hand. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. So in the middle of his drunken, blasphemous attitude and revelry, a supernatural hand appears from God. I can't tell you what it looked like. I can't tell you if it was all just a hand floating around. I just know he saw it. It was there. And God's patience now has come to an end. God is long-suffering. Amen? He is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But he has limit, and it will come to an end for this world too. So, just like it did in the time of the flood, God looked down and saw that men's imaginations and heart was on evil continually. He had enough. He destroyed the whole world except for the 8 souls in the ark. What's interesting is that they have been excavating in Babylon. And at the excavation, they discovered a large room of a palace that at the time, would have been at the time of Belshazzar. Guess how big this room was? 55 feet wide and 169 feet long, and it had plaster walls. This is interesting because that's a huge banquet room. And at the end of the room was a platform a place where a king would sit so he could be elevated above the people. So even the archaeology, eventually it catches up with the Bible. Now, going to look at verse number 6, because this is really interesting to me. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosened, and his knees smote one against another. Do you understand what he's seeing, what he's going through? He is afraid. So afraid his knees are clacking together when he tries to stand. You know, it reminded me of a cartoon, well, that's exactly what he was. He's a cartoon of a character, and his knees are just bouncing back and forth, and his loins, I just don't want, okay, I'll go on. But you get the idea. All right, so let's go on here. So he has literally lost the color in his face. You ever seen somebody that frightened? That lost his sheer terror has gripped his heart. And he couldn't stand up because the strength that he had left him. I'm here to tell you, friends, this won't be the last time fear manifests itself that way. Go with me to the book of Haggai. Haggai, chapter number 2. That's sandwiched in between Zephaniah and Zechariah, almost to the end. Haggai, chapter 2, verse 7 says, And I will shake all nations, And the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. God is going to shake things up in this world one day. It's coming. In the book of Zephaniah, the book right before Haggai, Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 14 says, the great day of the Lord is near, it is near, and hasteth greatly, even the voice of the Lord, of the day of the Lord, that the mighty man shall cry there bitterly. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of the trumpet and the alarm against fenced cities and against the high towers. And I will bring distress upon men, that they shall walk like blind men, because they have sinned against the Lord, and their blood shall be poured out as dust, and their flesh as the dung. Those are strong words from God. And the fear that they're going to experience. I look in the book of Revelation, it says, when they're going to say, have the rocks fall on us, because they're so afraid of what they're about to happen to them. Now let's go back to Daniel 5 and look at Belshazzar's shortcoming. Verse number 7. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet, a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So the same kind of advisors that advised his grandfather, because that's who Nebuchadnezzar is to him. It's not his, it's his, he's the grandson, and he's the grandfather. It was common back, just a side note, it's common back in the ways, it was call your father this, but they call Abraham their father, but he's not really their father, he's a long ways down the road. So that's a common greeting. But these are the same guys, same type of guys that Nebuchadnezzar called. And how did they do for Nebuchadnezzar? It was useless. They were useless then, and they're going to be useless to Belshazzar too. So he is so afraid that he promised them everything, that they can have this, they can have this. He can be third ruler. And then in verse 8, we see that, let me read verse 8 again. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writings, nor make known to the king the interpretations. Well, they couldn't read it. They couldn't understand it. And you know, there's not much difference even today. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 14 says, the natural man understandeth not the things of God, and neither indeed can he, because they are spiritually discerned. You know, I don't expect people to just sit down and take up this book and, like I told you, before I was saved, I read the entire Bible. It was a wonderful book, I thought. I read the Old Testament, because we didn't have a TV when I got married, and I'd come home from work and I'd read this book, because we didn't have any other books. We didn't have much. We lived in one little bedroom apartment, and I'd come home and I'd read these books, I started in Genesis, and it was like a story. And it is a story, but it's more than a story. I know that now. But back then, that's all it was to me. And so I couldn't wait to get home to see what happened next. Because it wasn't, it's like one of those things, you read this, and then you stop and you go, oh man, what's going to happen? But you got to stop because you got to do other things. But I couldn't wait to get home. They couldn't understand it. I didn't understand it. I was a natural man. The facts, yeah, I can understand facts. But the spiritualness that's there, I didn't understand it at all until I got saved. That's when I started and got myself in a New Testament church and began to do what the commission said, teach them to observe all things. So that's, again, why we're here today. We are a teaching institute. We are not only a preaching church, we're a teaching church. That's what we're supposed to be. All right, so he has this request, and the results in verse number 9 Verse 9 says, in chapter 5 of Daniel, then was the king Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. So that's to be understood, because they had no idea what this is all about. Now again, back to the queen, because she's again interesting. She comes in, and this is Belshazzar's mother, okay, Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. And she probably remembered what her father said about Daniel. And to remind you what her father said about Daniel, go to chapter 4. Because Belshazzar says in verse number 8, "But at the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods, and before him I told the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, and no secret troubleth thee, tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof." Now drop down to verse 18 with me. "This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof, for as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation, but thou art able, for the spirit of the holy gods is in thee." So she probably remembered all this that he had said about Daniel. So she talks about Daniel's reputation here in verse number 11 again. She says, "There is a man in thy kingdom, in whom the spirit of the holy gods and the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father the king, I say thy father made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpretation of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation." So the queen here is using every noun, every adjective she could think of here to tell Belshazzar that Daniel is the most intelligent, the most gifted, the most capable man in the kingdom. Call him. So in verse 13 then, it says, Then was Daniel brought in before the king. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father hath brought out of Jewry? And I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and the light and understanding, excellent wisdom is found in thee. So Daniel here is being requested. Daniel wasn't found with the other wise men. And the question is, why wasn't he found with the other wise men? Because he has stood alone by himself ever since he was a teenager. He never got chummy with these heathens. And so he's now in his mid to late 80s. Remember that. In this chapter, he's in his mid to late 80s. And he is still refusing to compromise his convictions. Now, the king's request, again in verse 13, having brought in, and then verse 14 picks up, I have even heard of thee, and the spirit of the gods that is in thee, that thou light and understanding, excellent wisdom is found in thee. So Daniel is known to Belshazzar by reputation only, but he is known. And apparently Daniel had faded into the background over these years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, and nobody was using him any longer. Now, notice appeal here for help in verse 15. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. I want you to know something. Daniel is not impressed by the attention he is now given, nor is he interested in being the third ruler of the kingdom, especially a kingdom that only has hours left to be. So Daniel isn't intimidated by kings as a young man, and he's still not intimidated by kings as an old man. Now let's look at what the sermon actually says. Notice the first thing here, the integrity of Daniel in verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself. In other words, you can keep them. And give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. So he didn't want anything the king had to offer because they meant nothing to him. These things, it doesn't mean a thing to him. And so Belshazzar, let me just say, he thought Daniel could be bought, just like all these other guys. Now the illustration of Nebuchadnezzar again, he says in talking about him in verse 17, last part of that, he did. And then in verse 18 he says, O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him, whom he would slew, and whom he would be kept alive, and whom he would set up, and whom he would put down. But when his heart was lifted up, he is a prideful man, and his mind hardened in pride, he was disposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him, reminding him what has happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men. So, Nebuchadnezzar was a proud man, right? He was so proud of his power that he built this monstrosity of a statue to himself. Well, God struck him down until he learned the lesson. And he's trying to get this across to Belshazzar. The indictment here is he sinned against knowledge. Verse 22. Notice what it says. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, has not humbled thine heart, though thou knowest all this. He knew all about what happened to his grandfather. So he can't claim ignorance. He knew what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He failed to humble himself like Nebuchadnezzar did. Now he blasphemed God, verse 23. But has lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords and thy wives. Thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and of gold and of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, thou hast not glorified. So he is willfully blaspheming God. People do it all the time. They think of God. You know, you talk to somebody and they say, well, if God is the God up there, why doesn't he strike me down? That's blasphemy, the arrogance of them. So, he committed adultery, or not adultery, idolatry is what I want to say, with the worship of these false things that man has made. And that's the end of a progression. You turn your heart against God, you're going to end up worshiping other things, especially yourself. That's what happens. So he first knew the truth, and then he turned from the truth. He then blasphemed God, who was the true God, and finally, he worships false gods. So, let's look at what happens here in verse 24 of Daniel 5. Verse 24 says, "Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. Many, many tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Many, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it." Many means numbered. In other words, simply put, your number is up. That's what he's telling him twice. Your number is up. Your number is up. And so God wrote it twice for emphasis to let him know that. Belshazzar, your number is up and there is nothing you can do about it. Notice the calculation, verse 27 then. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and found wanting. Tekel has a double meaning. It means to be weighed and to be found light. So God told Belshazzar that he's been weighed and was too light in spiritual value. There was nothing there. Now, it's interesting because he's not the only one, but he's the one who's the king on the throne. And he is, God is turning to him because he's going to set an example for everybody else. And then we find in verse 28, Paris, the kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Paris, or upharsin as it was used, another word that was used earlier, means to divide or to break, indicating that the Babylonian Empire would be broken and divided, and it certainly was that night. So let's look at what happens here in verse 29. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Yes, Daniel interpreted the dream. He's rewarding him like he said, but there's something else hidden here. Did you notice? He doesn't believe him. He doesn't believe the handwriting on the wall. Why? Because he's giving him this privilege to be the third in the kingdom. He doesn't believe the kingdom's about ready to fall. He's being generous because he said he would do it, but he doesn't believe what Daniel said. That's the point. And so, what verse did I leave off of? Verse 30. Okay, well, let me read it again. In that night, Belshazzar was the king of the Chaldeans slain. There he is. And the Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old, 62. So, it happened the very night that Belshazzar had his drunken feast. The Persians are outside the city. And there's a little description about what day of the week or day it was. We know it was in October, and we know it was 539 BC. But some say the 11th, some say the 12th, some say the 13th of October. Doesn't matter what day it was, really. It happened on that day. So the Medes and the Persians built a dam on the Euphrates River that night and diverted its flow, and they came under the walls of the city and destroyed it, as God said it was going to happen. We're going to close in an invitation here in a minute, Brother Mike. What does all this mean to me? God has limits. And he will avenge. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. I will repay. He had said that in the past about Babylon. He told us what was going to happen to Babylon, and it happened to Babylon. When he told Nebuchadnezzar, thou art the head of gold, but after you is coming somebody else. That's the chest and the arms. That's the silver. That's the Medes and the Persians. And they came and they conquered, just as God said. Well, we got the rest of the statue to look forward to, and it's going to come to pass too, especially the revived Roman Empire, which is coming very soon in our day. Are you ready? Do you know Christ? Are you going to witness to others and tell them, warn them? We need to. Let's all stand.